I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. There's a popular myth that we only use 10% of our brain power. What if we could consciously use our whole brain? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor captivated scientists and seers alike when she described her brain attack from a neuroscientist's perspective. Her hemorrhagic stroke left her speechless and unable to move the right side of her body, but some aspects of the experience were extremely positive.
Dr. Taylor has made a miraculous recovery. She's gained extraordinary insights into how our brains function.
Why is the relationship between your right and left hemispheres so fascinating?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, learn about whole brain living.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention show the biggest drop in life expectancy in the U.S. since World War II. Most of the decline was due to COVID-19 deaths, although the opioid epidemic has also played a role. More than 600,000 Americans have died since the pandemic began. That's more than twice the number of U.S. military casualties during the Second World War. Overall, life expectancy was 78.8 years in 2019, dropping to 77.3 years in 2020. That may not seem like much, but on a population level, it is horrifying. Hispanic and African American communities were especially hard hit. Hispanic men lost nearly 4 years of life expectancy last year. Once the pandemic is brought under control, life expectancy will probably rise again. However, it may take years.
Statin-type cholesterol-lowering drugs are among the most commonly prescribed medicines in the world. New research suggests that people taking statins are less likely to die from COVID-19 infections. The study reviewed medical records of more than 10,000 patients hospitalized with COVID between January and September 2020. Those who were already taking a statin were 25% less likely to have severe disease and 40% less likely to die from the infection. Many people were taking blood pressure medicine along with the statin. Since high blood pressure and heart disease predispose people to bad outcomes from COVID-19, the researchers had to do some sophisticated statistical analysis to untangle the risks. They suggest that the anti-inflammatory activity of statins could explain the potential benefit.
Coffee has had a bad reputation when it comes to irregular heart rhythms. Doctors often tell patients to avoid caffeinated coffee to reduce their risk of arrhythmias. A new study contradicts that conventional wisdom, however. Researchers analyzed data from the UK Biobank over a decade. Nearly 400,000 people were included in the review. Those who usually drank coffee were no more likely to develop rhythm disturbances than those who avoided coffee. In addition, people who are genetically predisposed to metabolize caffeine slowly were no more susceptible to irregular heart rhythms. Even more intriguing, this analysis hints that each additional cup of coffee a person drinks per day lowers the risk of arrhythmias by roughly 3%. Of course, no one should rely on coffee or caffeine to control heart rhythm irregularities, and some people can't tolerate coffee at all. But the old prohibition of coffee to prevent heart rhythm problems may need to be revised. An invited commentary concludes, the current study suggests that we can tell patients that waking up to a cup of coffee is not a dangerous ritual.
People with diabetes are at increased risk for cardiovascular disease and premature death. A new study involving 10 Western European countries reveals that cycling is beneficial for people with diabetes. In this epidemiological research, nearly 7,500 adults had diabetes. Over the course of 111,000 person years of follow-up, those who regularly rode a bicycle were 24% less likely to die compared to those who did not ride. This study reinforces previous research from Denmark showing a 40% reduction in mortality statistics among cyclists.
Are there ways to keep your brain healthy as well as your body? Scientists with the Rush Memory and Aging Project suggest that use it or lose it applies to gray matter as well as muscle. They followed 1,900 initially healthy older individuals for an average of 7 years. Over 450 of the volunteers developed Alzheimer's disease. The researchers found that cognitive activity late in life had a major impact on the risk for cognitive decline. The most engaged people seem to delay the onset of Alzheimer's disease by up to 5 years. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Years ago, Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor suffered a stroke, but as a neuroscientist, she had a unique perspective on her experience. When we spoke with her, she described what it was like to have most of the left side of her brain out of commission and how the part of her brain that was working perceived her unity with the universe.
Today, we turn again to neuroanatomist Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor. She has a more fully developed analysis of how the various parts of our brain work together. Dr. Taylor is the author of the memoir My Stroke of Insight, a brain scientist's personal journey. Her most recent book is Whole Brain Living, The Anatomy of Choice and the Four Characters That Drive Our Life.
Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, welcome back to the People's Pharmacy.
It is so good to be with you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Taylor, you are the author of an absolutely extraordinary book titled My Stroke of Insight, in which you describe having a massive brain hemorrhage. As a neuroscientist, you were able to understand what happened differently than most people. Can you please take a few moments to tell us about that experience many years ago?
Many years ago. Yes, I was teaching and performing research at Harvard Medical School, and my focus of interest was how does our brain create our perception of reality? And I cared about this because I have a brother who's diagnosed with the brain disorder schizophrenia, and his brain organized information completely differently than mine did. And I thought, at a biological level, what is the difference between the brain of someone who would be defined as neurotypical in comparison to someone's brain like my brother who would be diagnosed with schizophrenia? So I was teaching and performing research. I was very happy. And then I woke up one day and I had a major hemorrhage in the left half of my brain. And over the course of 4 hours, the circuitry in my left hemisphere began to go offline circuit by circuit. And this was ability by ability. So by the end of that morning, I could not walk, talk, read, write, or recall any of my life. And yet I was still a conscious person. I just didn't have left hemisphere skill set or personality anymore.
What happened then?
Well,
this sounds like this is a big pickle. Here you are.
Yes.
You're presumably your brain is telling you were aware that something was going very wrong. And at the same time, you weren't panicked.
Well, I am a neuroanatomist, so I study the anatomy of the brain and I teach the anatomy of the brain. And what that means is that I have a visualization inside of my own mind of how the different cells work together in their complex circuits in order for us to be able to, for example, have sound come in our ear and then ultimately have the perception of sound, the cells that are organized organized in a circuitry level to create sound. Dog is a sound, and then another group of cells in that circuitry places meaning on sound. So this was how I think. And on that morning, I, through the eyes of a scientist, watched these cellular circuits going offline one at a time, of being able to have an assessment of where is the problem. But I had no idea what the problem was, because I'm a neuroanatomist. I'm a PhD. I'm a scientist. I'm not an MD neurologist. So I don't have a lot of experience personally, other than what I read in books and in classes about stroke. But I did know the warning signs of stroke. But in the meantime, I wasn't really exhibiting the typical signs of stroke until my right arm went paralyzed. And then it was like, oh my gosh, I'm having a stroke. And then I thought to myself, wow, this is so cool. How many brain scientists have the opportunity to observe from the inside out this kind of an experience? So I think I was fortunate on the recovery end of having had a severe stroke, because I understood cells and I understood circuitry and I respected the brain's ability to recover. But on the morning of the stroke, when it was happening, I think it might have been a disadvantage, because I was fascinated and curious about it, instead of, I'm not right, I need to call 911 now.
Now, Dr. Taylor, I kind of recall from our first interview that there was at some point during the experience almost a sense of euphoria, which seems bizarre for somebody having a bleeding stroke in the brain.
Exactly. Well, the left hemisphere, the right and left hemispheres are mirror images of one another at a functional cellular level. But those mirror images of one another, they process the same information, but in different ways, so that the right hemisphere exists in the present moment. It's right here, right now. It's perceiving this collage of all of our sensory experiences. And we have the ability to bring our mind into the present moment. We also have this magnificent left hemisphere, and it is designed to take information about the present moment, immediately compare that information to our past experience, asking the question, have I ever had this experience before? And is there a reason for me to have alarm, alert? No, I don't want it, push it away. And then that information, if I feel safe, or even if I feel anxiety, then I have this left thinking tissue, which is my rational brain interacting with the external world. So we have these two very different ways of experiencing ourselves. And on the morning of my hemorrhage, the hemorrhage was in the left hemisphere, and it started as a small break in a blood vessel, and that blood clot just got bigger and bigger and bigger until it completely shut down the circuitry in my left hemisphere. And what that did then was it relieved the inhibiting fibers from that left hemisphere reaching over into my right hemisphere through that band of some 300 million fibers of the corpus callosum, taking the inhibition off of what was going on in the right hemisphere. And for me, that was an incredible experience of the present moment. And I felt this incredible sense of love and peace and euphoria.
Could you briefly describe the difference between a bleeding or hemorrhagic stroke, the one that you had, and the more common thrombotic stroke that affects so many people every year in this country?
Absolutely. And it's really important that we understand that blood is brought up into the brain with pretty high pressure system, and blood runs in blood vessels, And blood vessels, then, they don't have direct connection with the neurons, which are the major conducting cells of the nervous system. Instead, there are these little supportive cells called glial cells that sit between the neurons and the blood vessels, because blood, and then the neurons will say to the glial cells, hey, I need more calcium, or I need more potassium, or I need more whatever. And then the glial cells go to the blood vessels and kind of take it out of the blood and then deliver it to the neurons. And I emphasize this because what I'm trying to say is that blood, when it comes in direct contact with neurons, is poisonous. It's toxic. It will actually interrupt the ability of those neurons to communicate with one another, and it may actually kill neurons. And so the two different types of stroke happen if the blood vessel bursts and blood then seeps out into the extracellular matrix, the space between the neurons and the glial cells. Then it can be very devastating to the environment of the brain, making it impossible for the neurons to function or actually kill the neurons. And that is a hemorrhage, when a blood vessel breaks and then the contents of the blood actually comes in contact with the neurons and can hurt the neurons. The more common type of stroke is if a blood clot gets thrown off inside of the body and then it migrates up into the brain. Blood vessels taper, so they become smaller and smaller like a funnel. And that blood clot will travel in a blood vessel until the blood clot is too big to get through that tapering end. And then whatever tissue gets supplied by the blood beyond that spot where the blood clot has now secured itself, that tissue is no longer getting the oxygen that they need in order to survive. And so that's the more typical type of ischemic stroke.
And your stroke was, in fact, a hemorrhagic stroke, is that correct?
Yes, mine was a special kind of hemorrhagic stroke where I had an artery that was directly connected to a vein. And artery is a blood pressure system. And so blood comes in through the artery, and then that artery tapers to a really small level where the blood cells have to essentially line up in order in a capillary network. And that's a very, very low pressure system. And then at the other end of that capillary network normally is the vein. And the vein essentially absorbs via osmosis, absorbs the liquid back out and then brings it back ultimately into the heart to get replenished with oxygen. And in my brain, it was an arteriovenous malformation where the artery was directly connected to the vein with no capillary network in between. And as a result, the vein could not take the pressure of the artery and it popped off.
You're listening to Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor. She's affiliated with Indiana University School of Medicine. Her most recent book is Whole Brain Living, The Anatomy of Choice, and 4 Characters That Drive Our Life.
After the break, we'll hear about Dr. Taylor's amazing recovery.
It took a long time for her to recover completely from her devastating stroke. That defies conventional wisdom.
How can Dr. Taylor's experience help doctors treat others who've had a stroke?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy podcast is sponsored in part by Kaya Biotics. Kaya Biotics offers the first probiotics which are both certified organic and hypoallergenic.
All probiotics are produced in Germany under laboratory conditions with high-quality ingredients and under strict regulatory oversight.
The 3 available formulas are created for very specific purposes, such as strengthening the immune system, fighting yeast infections, and helping with weight loss.
To learn more about Kaya Biotics probiotics and the important topic of gut health, you can visit their website, KayaBiotics.com. That's Kaya Biotics.com. Use the discount code PEOPLE for $10 off your first purchase. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, organic probiotic products made in Germany, KayaBiotics.com.
Also by CocoVia, now offering its cardio health product with 500 milligrams of cocoa flavanols. More information at cocovia.com.
We're talking today about the brain. How a stroke affects the brain depends upon which area of the brain is deprived of blood flow and oxygen. It can leave lasting deficits. However, doctors sometimes underestimate a stroke patient's potential for recovery.
Our guest is neuroanatomist and author Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor. Dr. Taylor is the author of the memoir My Stroke of Insight, a brain scientist's personal journey. Her most recent book is Whole Brain Living, The Anatomy of Choice and the 4 Characters That Drive Our Life.
Dr. Taylor, clearly you have made an amazing recovery. Would you please tell us about it?
Wow. Well, yes. I've been very, very fortunate. I did experience a severe hemorrhage, which wiped out major portions of my left hemisphere. And so on the morning of the stroke, I could not walk, talk, read, write, or recall any of my life. I essentially became an infant in a woman's body. And I was so detached from my ability to function that, the right hemisphere has a completely different perception of self. In that left hemisphere, part of the cells that got wiped out is a group of cells in my left parietal region that define the boundaries of where I begin and where I end. That sounds weird, but it's like, how do I know when I look in a mirror that my face is actually a part of me, but that the glasses that I wear on my face are not a part of me? And I know that because there's a group of cells in that left hemisphere that define a holographic image of me to myself. So in the absence of those cells, I perceived myself in my right hemisphere to be open and expansive and as big as the universe, where I had become energy interacting with the energy around me. So that was a part of the state of euphoria and this incredible state of peacefulness was I was no longer relating to the body. At the same time, I had no language. And so language is cells in circuit. Every ability that we have because we have cells that are performing that function. So my ability to create sound, I didn't have that ability anymore because those cells were offline. And then the ability to intellectually place meaning on the sounds that others were creating, those cells were wiped out, swimming in a pool of blood. So I couldn't understand anyone else. But I realized even in this condition that my brain is this magnificent collection of cells. And if I stay out of my own way, and I'm willing to try to focus my attention, which was very, very difficult because I just wanted to be in the present and I was just present and it felt fantastic there. And it actually was work to try to watch someone's lips in order to try to match the sound that they're creating to the lip movement. And was there any awareness in my brain left in that left hemisphere that allowed me to try to place meaning on those sounds and put it all together? So it was daunting in the beginning because I was so completely detached. And I had an absolutely silent mind in that the language centers in my left hemisphere were completely offline. So I just didn't have I didn't have a neuron to hang it on. That's that's what I joke and say, but it was true. I didn't have the ability. So for 2.5 weeks before surgery, I had a completely silent mind. And then it was 2.5 weeks after surgery that my mind, it was like like a radio was starting to tune in, and it was like, oh, there's that again. Oh, there's sound. Oh, there's perhaps meaning. And that was where all hope really began for a possibility of a recovery. Was I would not be able to function like a normal human being in our society if I couldn't have language, if I couldn't understand when others spoke and be able to communicate, because we as a society don't know how to communicate well with someone who doesn't have that skill set or even that possibility of a skill set. So for me,
Dr.
it was
Taylor,
yes.
how long did it take for you to get language back?
It was different forms of language. For me to be able to create sound, I began to grunt and try to play with sound in the first few weeks, but it had no meaning. It would be a good month after surgery happened in order for me to have some real understanding. I had to relearn how to speak and how to listen, and how to reading and writing were like, oh my God, a foreign language. And mathematics would take 4 years. So the overall process of this recovery from circuit by circuit by circuit of ability took 8 years.
Now, I have to tell you, I suspect most of our listeners and many health professionals would say, the standard wisdom is that when somebody has a stroke, whether it's a hemorrhagic stroke or a thrombotic stroke from a clot, 6 weeks, maybe a couple of months, and then you kind of plateau. That's it. You don't get better. And you're talking about an 8-year recovery process. Kind of defies conventional wisdom.
Yes, it does. Thank you for pointing that out, because, the brain, neuroplasticity, the ability of brain cells to rearrange which other cells they're communicating with is real and alive, and it makes our ability to learn. And these cells in our brain are rearranging and learning constantly until the day we die. So there is a spike in the ability of neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to learn immediately after trauma, because during that period of like 6 to 8 weeks, there is a process of neurogenesis which is the ability of the brain to actually create and grow some new neurons and place them in the positions of the trauma in order for there to be new possibilities. And when you think about how long have they been saying, they being the medical establishment, that if you don't get something back in 3 or 6 months, you're not going to get it back. We've known about neuroplasticity and neurogenesis only since around neuroplasticity in the mid 80s, but neurogenesis in the early 2000s. So we've learned about the brain, and neuroplasticity is real. And what that means is that the brain has the ability to gain new connections, gain new possibility, gain new recovery. And I'm certainly a living example of that.
Well, it seems as though it is almost miraculous. Has the medical profession ever acknowledged that?
Well, it's so much in that I have definitely been invited to many neurological schools, medical schools, nursing schools, PT, OT systems in order to talk about the brain, talk about neuroplasticity, talk about what I did in order to recover, talk about what I needed in order to recover, and certain things that got in the way of my ability to recover. So, yes, I've been well celebrated, I would say.
Perhaps you could just very quickly summarize for us what you did need in order to recover. What sorts of therapies were especially helpful?
What I needed was sleep. Sleep was the most important factor. And I needed my visitors and my family to cheer me on and bring positive love and positive energy to me. I essentially rehabilitated myself on a schedule that was right for me. I did have speech and language. I needed that. And that was very helpful. At the same time, it was very devastating because I would work so hard in order to try to gain something. And then I would go in, and the ultimate goal of my speech therapy was to see where did I break down, not celebrate how much did I have now, how hard had I worked, but where was my next break? So that was really emotionally difficult for me because they were always looking for what I couldn't do instead of celebrating what I could do. And so I used my awareness and wisdom and my faith in the ability of the brain to recover and my understanding of how the brain wires itself in order to create new function. And unfortunately, even though I lost language and my identity and my individuality and my ego and my education, book knowledge, I still had a beautiful right hemisphere, which thinks in pictures. So I could have sculpted for you an abdomen, but I could not label for you the different parts of a stomach. So I could visually use my visualization and my understanding of the nervous system in order to help guide myself through what do I need next, what's in the way. And my mother was fantastic to help observe and allow me to unfold my own recovery. It was really an amazing journey.
Now, sleep is crucial. That's what you noticed. Why?
Oh, sleep is, when we're awake, we are processing through our sensory systems literally trillions upon gazillions of bits of data in every moment. And this magnificent organ, these neurons are processing this information, but cells are living creatures. They eat and they create waste, and they are working very hard all the time. And when we go to sleep, it's a great time for the garbage cleaners to essentially come in and flush out all the waste. And then this is when the circuitry that has been stimulated during the day and the lessons learned actually get strengthened, the circuits inside of the brain that perform that understanding. So sleep was critical. If I had not had sleep, I can guarantee you I would not be here speaking to you fluently the way that I am.
I'd like to learn more about some of the other therapies that you learned that you had to work with when it came to just recapturing not just speech, but thinking. And I have a little bit of a crazy sidebar here, and it has to do with the fact that you've mentioned visualization a couple of times. And you had the ability to visualize the brain or visualize anatomy. I actually suffer from I think, fairly rare neurological condition called aphantasia. What that is that I can't see or visualize things the way you can. I don't have a mind's eye the way you do. And so I'm one of those people who has to sort of make it up, but really can't. Can you explain a little bit the difference between your brain and my brain? Because clearly there is a profound difference when it comes to this idea of visualization. And then please talk about how you recaptured some of the other important functions during your recovery.
So I think that that's very interesting, Joe. And I want you to close your eyes. Well, you can't see your lips anyway, but I want you to visualize. Can you visualize what your lips look like? Do you know
Absolutely
the shape of your
not.
lips? Really?
No. I mean, when I close my eyes, it's black. There's nothing. I can't see or visualize anything. And there are about, I think, 1% to 2% of the population that have this condition like I do.
However, you have the ability to recognize yourself in a mirror. Is that true?
Correct.
Okay. So you're bringing in information and you can do recognition. And my guess is that, have you tried to practice small things? Have you tried to learn how to visualize something?
I've tried. I just can't.
Okay.
I mean, it is literally a black veil. When I shut my eyes, there's nothing there.
Okay. Well, every ability we have is because we have cells that are performing that function. So all that says to me is that in your genius brain, which does all these magnificent things so well, then there is a group of cells for you that knows how to do a visualization that is not hooked into your system very well. And we're all unique. And so that may be your uniqueness. One of my things is I don't have a good ear for foreign languages. I'm horrible at it. I cannot distinguish between different kinds of rolling R's that many languages use in order, and to them it's easy and it's normal. It's a roll on the front of the tongue or the back of the tongue or a harsher thing. I have no ear for that whatsoever. So those cells in my brain have not been differentiated to be able to process that information in a refined way. And so, it might be interesting for you to jump into an MRI and look and see at different parts of your brain to see, which cells might be missing for that. But the ability to visualize and have that think in a movie is in that right hemisphere. So, but there's also a lot of other things going on in that right hemisphere. But yeah, it'd be fun to sit down and have dinner with you sometime and talk about that.
I would love that.
Yeah.
But tell us a little bit more about your recovery, because I suspect that there are a lot of people who are listening who know someone who's had a stroke,
yes.
wonder, how should they interact with them?
Exactly.
Yes.
How should we be treating people who have had a stroke?
Well, kindly, first of all. And, my mother stood like a guard at the door, and she would not let just anybody come in with any frame of mind. I needed people to come in, bring me positive energy, bring me their love. None of the woe is me, none of the tears, none of the sadness, because I would just pick that out and then that would paralyze me. I needed people to come in and take responsibility for the energy they brought into the room. I needed them to come for short visits because otherwise I would be exhausted, and allow me, just love me. That's really what I needed. And I know that, we have anxiety. Oh my gosh, Jill's had a stroke. It's so hard to go visit her. I go in and I talk and I get anxious and I talk really fast and she doesn't talk back and she just looks at me and it's like, and so I'm uncomfortable. So I don't want to go visit her again because I'm now so uncomfortable. And it's like, my stroke's not about you folks. My stroke's about me and what I need. And what I need is your love. And I do need you to come visit me. And I do need you to bring me your positive energy. And then come back tomorrow, but short visits. Don't come and pay attention to if I'm looking tired, I'm worn out. And if I'm asleep, do not wake me up.
You're listening to Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, a neuroanatomist affiliated with Indiana University School of Medicine. Her most recent book is Whole Brain Living, The Anatomy of Choice and the 4 Characters That Drive Our Life.
After the break, find out why the theory that the left brain is rational and analytical and the right brain is artistic and emotional is an oversimplification.
According to Dr. Taylor, both left and right halves of our brain have emotional and cognitive activities and strengths, but they are different.
How can we take what she's learned about how the brain works and apply it to our personal lives?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This People's Pharmacy podcast is supported in part by CocoVia with a special offer on heart-healthy products. Starting on Monday, November 16th through Sunday, November 22nd, People's Pharmacy listeners can get 25% off on the heart health products.
The heart health supplements contain 450 milligrams of cocoa flavanols, plant-based nutrients from natural cocoa. taking these flavonols daily supports cardiovascular health.
To take advantage of this special holiday offer, use the code CV25 when you check out. Even already discounted products like subscription and 3- and 6-month options are on sale.
The unflavored dark chocolate drink mix is a great heart-healthy alternative to hot cocoa. It has no sugar and only 20 calories, so you can indulge with no guilt at all. The code for this special offer is CV25. Learn more at cocovia.com.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Cocovia, now offering its cardio health product with 500 milligrams of cocoflavanols. More information at cocovia.com.
And by Kaya Biotics, organic probiotic product made in Germany. KAYABiotics.com.
Have you used the left brain, right brain shorthand to describe someone who's very logical and rational, or someone who's more artistic and emotional? Could that be an oversimplification? How can we all benefit from the insights Dr. Taylor achieved by analyzing her stroke and extraordinary recovery?
We're talking with neuroanatomist Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor. Dr. Taylor is the author of the memoir My Stroke of Insight, a brain scientist's personal journey. Her most recent book is Whole Brain Living, The Anatomy of Choice and the 4 Characters That Drive Our Life.
Dr. Taylor, we'd like to turn to your new book, Whole Brain Living, The Anatomy of Choice and the 4 Characters That Drive Our Life. I suspect that many of your colleagues, health professionals, researchers, as well as most of our listeners, think of our brains as having 2 hemispheres. The left in charge of thinking, the right in charge of emotions. Can you tell us a little bit about the split brain studies of the 70s and 80s that showed how different, even opposing personalities can exist in the same person?
Absolutely. You know, I feel very blessed that I was young in my early 20s when the split brain studies were happening in the 70s. And what they did was there were they had these physicians were having to deal with patients who were having these major seizure activity in the brain. And seizure is when brain cells essentially move into an explosion of output, and it grows and grows and grows because the energy at the focal point of a seizure begins at a center, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it was exploding over into the opposite hemisphere as well through the 300 million axonal fibers of that corpus callosum. And so it was, they decided, okay, well, let's cut that corpus callosum and see if that will block the seizure activity from going to one hemisphere to the other. And so they did that. And in testing these patients, they recognized that the right hemisphere had a different personality than the left hemisphere. And so each of these people were now having 2 different characters, obviously different characters inside of their head. And so we as normal human beings who have our 2 hemispheres connected with one another, we perceive ourselves to be one person, but we know that we have different moods, and we know that we have different characters and different kinds of conflicting voices going on inside of our head, which is completely normal up to a certain degree, of course. So when I talk about whole brain living, I'm thinking about how do we understand these different groups of cells in these different hemispheres And what do we know about each of these different characters? How can we get to become more familiar with what is normal inside of ourselves? And then how do we make peace inside of our own head? And then how do we create the life that we want to live based on what we now understand about the different character profiles that can exist between these two hemispheres?
Well, Dr. Taylor, the common perception is a kind of shorthand in which we think, well, the left brain, it's in charge of language and it's rational, and the right brain, it's emotional. Is that an oversimplification?
That is an oversimplification, because when you look at the anatomy of the brain, the emotional system, the cells of the limbic system, and this is going to include the cells of the amygdala, the hippocampus, the anterior cingulate gyrus, part of the prefrontal cortex, these cells are evenly divided between the right and the left hemisphere. So what that means is we have two amygdala, two hippocampi, two anterior cingulate gyrus, and two whole structures of limbic tissue. So both the right and the left hemispheres have emotional tissue. In addition to that, the difference between us and other mammals is the degree of our neocortex, our higher thinking tissue. So we have higher thinking tissue in the left brain, and we have higher thinking tissue in the right brain. So we end up with two emotional systems, modules of cells, if you will, as well as two thinking groups of cells. And although it is true that the left thinking tissue is that rational thinking, logical, methodical, A-type personality that interacts with the external world, with me, the individual, the ego, and that was a group of cells that I lost, the right hemisphere also has thinking tissue, but it is not the rational thinking tissue. Instead, it's thinking tissue related to, again, remember, the right hemisphere is the right here, right now machine without the individuation of me, the ego. So the right hemisphere is emotion of the present moment. The thinking in the right hemisphere is bigger picture perspective of the me and of the external world. And I become as big as the universe in that perception, where the left brain has emotion of my past and my future and thinking of my past and my future. So we end up with four very different modules of cells that result in very predictable personalities.
Now, Dr. Taylor, you are a neuroanatomist, so I'm going to ask you to explain the anatomy of the two cognitive minds and the two emotional systems. Why do you refer to them as four characters?
When information comes in through the external world, through our sensory systems, it then goes off into our emotional tissue, the cells of our amygdala on each hemisphere. The right hemisphere stays in the present moment. Information in the present moment, sensory systems are coming in right here, right now. They don't have a past and they don't have a future. Information in the present moment stays in the present moment in the right hemisphere. So that emotional system is looking at emotionally processing it as experience. What does it feel like to be right here, right now? What does the humidity feel like in the air? What does it feel like to have these glasses on my face? What does it feel like to see the dapple of light as it passes through the trees? How my whole soul can shift into the energy around me, because that's what the right hemisphere does. It doesn't, again, have that boundary. The emotional system of the left hemisphere, however, brings in the information of the present moment, and it goes into that left amygdala, and the amygdala says, alarm, alarm, alert, alert. Am I safe? And then it processes that information by looking into our past experience and saying, yes, I feel safe. Everything feels familiar. And then my hippocampus can turn on in that emotional system. And then information, we are feeling creatures who thinks, which means information is coming in and going through those emotional cells of that limbic system before it gets passed up into our higher cognition on both sides. So I know that there's a character in me that knows all the pain of my past. I know that part of myself. I can hook into that part of myself by just reflecting on some of the pain from my past or my discontent in the present because I had a preconceived notion of what I wanted the present moment to be, but it's not what I wanted. So now I'm not happy. Or I have a preconceived notion of what I want it to be. And it is that. It is the perfect wedding. And so I'm not a bridezilla. So I know that part of myself, and I know the intellectual, rational part of my left thinking tissue. That's a completely different character. She's a thinking character, not an emotional, feeling character. She's just organizing and creating order in the external world. She knows how to be punctual. She knows how to work with a clock. She defines what is right and wrong, what is good and bad based on the definition of who I define myself to be, again, as an ego, as an individual. Those are very different parts of me that care about very different things than the characters in my right brain who are right here, right now, the experience of the present moment, and then the thinking connection that feels an incredible sense of gratitude and awareness that I am alive and that I exist at all. So getting to know each of these different groups of cells, the character profiles that they are responsible for creating in our lives, then gives us the power to choose moment by moment. Well, do I want to be in my rational brain right now, or do I want to go be playful in the present moment? We all have that ability.
Well, let me interrupt you there because I think that's really key. That's one of the powerful messages of your book. I'm one of those left brain thinking people who spends a lot of time trying to figure things out and what should I do next and what's going to happen and how does that relate to what happened in the past. And I love your character 3 because you describe the character 3, this right brain emotional character, and you say if you want to shift quickly into your character 3, get experiential, do something fun, engage your sense of humor, and the messier the better. So anytime we laugh out loud, we can't help but be open, present, and completely vulnerable, which is why it feels so great and so good for us. So I guess my question, Dr. Taylor, is how do we get into that character 3 on a regular basis so that we can sometimes shed that thinking character 1 or 2?
Well, I think in the case of a strong character 1 or 2 in the left hemisphere, the character 1 and 2 have to be willing to allow you to go do something that feels irresponsible, feels like a waste of time to it. Because characters 3, the playful in the present moment, it just wants to go and be. It wants to go jump in the lake and feel the water against its skin. It wants to giggle and laugh and splash and get in the body. The body is this magnificent tool that it gets to use in order to go make a mess out in the world. So getting out of the definition of what is right and what is wrong, go be creative. Sign up for a painting class where there is no structure, go finger paint with no right and wrong and look at it. Bring your mind into the present moment and observe the sensory systems. Observe, don't analyze, just observe the way the lighting in the room hits different things without analyzing, just the big picture contextual. Oh my gosh, isn't that amazing? And look at it with that oh my gosh, isn't that amazing? And look at me. And oh my gosh, I have a body, and it's like I have life, and you have a biological thinking mind. And so, thinking about that cell and the beauty of that cell, and the cell is not an analytical process. We can't like go into the lab and really create, well, somebody probably can in this day and age, but the whole phenomenon of life is not a methodical thing. It's all these thousands of things happening simultaneously, but you really have to let your left brain recognize the value of it, because if the left brain doesn't have value for the right brain's experience of the present moment, then it will judge it negatively, and it will squash it down and say, well, that was 5 minutes wasted. Enough of that. I'm going to go back to work.
Dr. Taylor, how do we get our four characters, the two from the left brain and the two from the right brain, to work together? How will whole brain living help us connect better with ourselves and others?
Well, that's a beautiful question. And so I use an acronym called BRAIN, BRAIN, and I call it the brain huddle. And I see these four characters inside of my brain as my brain's team. And then I call a huddle. And so I will call a brain huddle periodically throughout my day, literally 20 or 30 times a day. And any of the characters, so in a moment, I will say brain huddle, and I pause myself and I bring my mind immediately to my breath, because my breath is always a grounding in the present moment. And I feel that. And then B is breath, focus on the breath. R is recognize which character was I exhibiting, which group of cells was I exercising when I called the huddle. And then R is recognize which character. A is appreciate the fact that I may have been in my rational left brain when I called the huddle, but I have four characters. And then I is inquire which of the four characters might I want to be in the next moment. And then N is navigate which character do I want moment by moment by moment as my life unfolds in moments. And the beauty of simply calling a brain huddle is all four of my characters come back online. And it's like, oh, I'm a conscious being. I can observe what's going on inside of my head. And then I have the power to choose moment by moment who and how I want to be in the world in order to create my best life.
Dr. Taylor, I suspect that a lot of the conflict that exists today in our society and around the world is people get locked into a position, a way of thinking, an argument. And so there's a confrontation, and they're barely able to listen to the other person, and they're already formulating their response, their argument, their challenge, why that person is wrong and why they are, in fact, correct. How do we do a brain huddle in a situation where we're just poised to strike rather than to listen or to perhaps move into a different part of our brain?
Isn't that a beautiful question? And the right word there is listen. If I'm not willing to pause, and part of pause means I'm not going to be in my reactive neurocircuitry of my amygdala and my hippocampi in either of those hemispheres. And I'm not going to be running my automatic reactivity. Instead, I'm actually going to listen. I'm going to use my thinking brain instead of my hostility of my aggressive emotional systems. And I'm actually allow myself to elevate beyond that passionate emotion into my rational thinking, as well as into my bigger picture contextual thinking that relates all information, not just to me, the individual, but to us as humanity and humanity in relationship to this beautiful planet. So allowing ourselves to recognize when we are feeling our emotional reactivity and recognize that that's not where our thinking happens. That's not where our real ability to negotiate, our ability ability to hear the other, but we have to be willing to observe and become aware of when we are in our reactivity and our own anxiety, and be willing to allow that to breathe through that, which actually takes 90 seconds from the moment we think a thought. It stimulates an emotion, and then we have a physiological response to what we're thinking and feeling. Observation and awareness of what I am instead of simply running on automatic is key to listening.
Dr. Taylor, observation and awareness sounds like mindfulness. You've also spoken about gratitude, and you've written about connectedness. All of these things sound more like spiritual concepts. Just exactly how well does this go down in the neuroscience community?
I've not had a problem with the neuroscience community. Neuroscience at this point in time is filled with many exploring minds that recognize that we can only learn so much about the left thinking, rational brain and the way it organizes information in the external world. The scientific method, by definition, is a method. A plus B has to equal C, and you have to be able to repeat that. Well, life in and of itself is not methodical. So we're realizing that if we want to explore the more subtle lessons of and abilities of humanity, we have to be able to figure out, how do we create really cool modern tools in order to measure it or look at it and see it? And we are expanding our awareness. Now, it is true that the language that has been placed on the brain has been, the left science-based mind, and then the right brain, it's all spiritual and woo-woo. Well, we're creating new labels for the scary spiritual woo-woo, and to actually understanding that every ability we have is because we have cells that create that ability. So my ability to experience the present moment and to feel expansive and enormous, there are actually cells in that right hemisphere. And there's some beautiful scientists, including Andrew Newberg, who is doing beautiful work in identifying how does the left hemisphere release its inhibition over the right hemisphere in order for us to be able to, for example, have the experience of being at one with God.
And finally, Dr. Taylor, how would you like to change the world with whole brain living?
I believe that the better we understand how to use any tool, then the more use we can get out of that tool. And I think that the better we can differentiate the different parts of our brain as different modules of cells that exhibit specific skill sets that result in specific personalities, the better we get to know all of our four characters, the more brain huddle ability we have inside of our own head to really live a conscious life, and then recognize that I have four characters and you have four characters. So every relationship, now there's 8 of us in here. How do we more peacefully navigate our relationships? And ultimately, I do believe that whole brain living is how humanity will evolve to the next level of being healthy, conscious, living individuals in relationship, not just to ourselves and one another, but in relationship to the context of this planet that we get to live with.
Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, it seems to me that we would all benefit from whole brain living. Our country and our world seem more polarized than ever. How can we take what you have learned and apply it both in our personal lives and in society as a whole?
I think that, when you look at machines and automated systems, they're push, 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 push. You turn a computer on and you leave it on for years until it dies and exhausts itself. As a living system, we can push, but we also have the pause. We have to push in order to get things done, which is very left brain. And then we have to hit the pause, which gives us time out of a stress circuitry in order to refuel our systems. And I think we are in such a left hemisphere skewed society of the values of more, bigger, richer. I want to be higher on the hierarchy than you are. We are going so fast in the push that we really need to spend more time in the pause. And a part of that unfortunate push is that our anxiety level has been turned on in that left hemisphere, and we are suffering. So many of us are suffering from all kinds of problems, which are neurologically based, especially we're existing in a society of anxiety where we don't feel safe because we're constantly pushing to be more in the external world. And we're not spending as much time on the reflection and on the peaceful nature of that right hemisphere. So that's why I wrote this book. I think that whole brain living will allow our systems to neutralize and integrate, and we will evolve.
Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
It's a privilege. Thank you for having me back.
You've been listening to Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor. She's a neuroanatomist affiliated with Indiana University School of Medicine. Her books include the memoir, My Stroke of Insight, A Brain Scientist's Personal Journey, and her most recent, Whole Brain Living, The Anatomy of Choice and the 4 Characters That Drive Our Life.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
The People's Pharmacy is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, with The People's Pharmacy.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, organic probiotic products made in Germany. KAYABiotics.com.
And by CocoVia Memory Plus, a cocoflavanol supplement backed by 4 clinical studies that show significant improvement in 3 different aspects of memory. More information at cocovia.com.
Today's show is number 1265. You can find the podcast on our website, peoplespharmacy.com.
When you go to peoplespharmacy.com, you can share your thoughts about today's show in the comments section of show number 1265.
We couldn't fit our entire interview with Dr. Taylor into this broadcast, but it is in the podcast. Listen to find out how whole brain living will improve your life. You'll also learn how her neuroscientist colleagues react to her emphasis on mindfulness, gratitude, and connectedness.
You can subscribe to our podcast through your favorite podcast provider. We post the show on our website on Monday morning. You might want to share it with a friend or family member.
At our website, you can sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about COVID-19 and other important health stories. By subscribing to the newsletter, you also get regular access to our weekly podcast, and you can find out ahead of time which topics we're covering.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show without you.